heart of Mongolia, during a time of war and upheaval, stood a place that became a symbol of terror. Urga prison, a fortress of stone where voices of the innocent and guilty alike were drowned in screams. Inside its walls, prisoners were not treated as people, but as shadows forgotten by the outside world. The air carried the stench of suffering, the sound of chains scraping against cold floors. Few who entered ever left alive, and those who did carried scars that would never heal. The year was 1918. Mongolia was caught in a storm of political upheaval, torn between foreign powers, civil conflict, and shifting alliances. Amid the chaos in the capital of Urga, today known as Ulaanbaatar, there stood a fortress of dread, Urga prison. To the outside world, it was simply a place for criminals, but for those who entered its gates, it became something far worse, a chamber of suffering where survival itself became an illusion. The prison's thick stone walls rose out of the steppe, silent and foreboding. Locals whispered about it with fear, calling it a place where men disappeared never to return. Prisoners came from all walks of life, rebels, debtors, thieves, and sometimes the innocent, caught in the sweep of political purges. Once inside, all were treated the same, stripped of dignity, chained like animals, and left at the mercy of guards who thrived on cruelty. Conditions inside were beyond brutal. Cells were damp, dark, and overcrowded. Prisoners were packed shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and rot. Food was scarce, a handful of moldy bread or a thin broth of boiled water. Disease spread quickly, taking the week before the guards even bothered with punishment. And punishment was never far away. Whips, iron chains, and torture devices were part of daily life. In Urga prison, pain was not the exception. It was the rule. This was not justice. It was survival in its cruelest form. And in 1918, it became a stain on Mongolia's history that would echo for generations. Inside Urga prison, daylight rarely touched the faces of those held captive. Prisoners were locked in cells carved from stone, with only a single slit in the wall for air. Rats scurried freely, feeding on scraps and sometimes on the weak who had fallen. The prison floor was damp with filth, and the smell of rot clung to every breath. For many, the nightmare began the moment the gate slammed shut, a sound that meant freedom was gone forever. The guards held absolute power, and with power came cruelty. Punishments were designed not only to wound the body but to break the spirit. Prisoners were whipped until their backs split open, forced to crawl on frozen floors, or left chained for days without food. Some were made to stand in bitter cold with no clothing until they collapsed. Others were locked in isolation, left to scream into the darkness until their voices gave out. Every act of brutality was a reminder. In Urga prison there was no mercy. But perhaps the cruelest punishment was hunger. Prisoners often received nothing more than a crust of bread in an entire day. Some scavenged from rats, others chewed on leather straps just to trick their stomachs into silence. Starvation became both a weapon and a sentence. To the guards, a prisoner's suffering was entertainment. To the prisoners, it was a slow death. By 1918, Urga prison was not just a place of confinement. It was a machine of despair, grinding down body and soul until only shadows remained. By the middle of 1918, Urga prison had become a graveyard for the living. Prisoners who entered with strength and hope were reduced to hollow shells within weeks. Disease spread quickly. Typhus, dysentery, and infections took more lives than the guards' punishments. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried, and often corpses lay for days beside the living, a grim reminder of what awaited them all. The guards, emboldened by fear, grew crueler with each passing month. They treated prisoners as entertainment. Fights were forced between the weak, with the winner barely rewarded with scraps of food. Others were dragged into the courtyard to be humiliated, beaten or executed without trial. The prison was no longer about law or order. It had become a stage for sadism. Yet even in this pit of despair, human will refused to vanish completely. Some prisoners whispered stories of escape, though few dared attempt it. Others shared what little food they had, forming bonds of survival. In the darkest nights, songs were hummed softly, almost in defiance, echoes of lives they once lived outside the walls. These small acts of resistance became sparks of humanity in a place built to extinguish it. Still, the overwhelming reality remained. In Urga prison, death was never far. For every whisper of hope, 10 cries of suffering filled the air. It was a place where time stood still, where each sunrise was not a blessing but another day of torment. As 1918 dragged on, Urga prison's reputation spread far beyond Mongolia's capital. Whispers of its horrors traveled along trade routes and through soldiers' stories, painting it as one of the darkest places in Asia. To locals, it became a name spoken only in fear, a warning to children, a shadow that haunted families whose loved ones never returned. For those trapped inside, it was not just a prison. It was a slow, methodical destruction of the human spirit. The daily routine was designed to break men. Prisoners awoke to the clang of chains and the bark of guards. Labor was backbreaking, hauling stones or digging pits with little purpose beyond punishment. Those too weak to work were beaten, left as examples to the others. Nights brought no rest, only the sound of coughing, groaning, and the cries of those punished in darkness. Sleep was shallow, broken by nightmares and the constant fear of what tomorrow might bring. Religion, once a comfort in Mongolian life, was twisted into torment. Monks and priests who were imprisoned found themselves mocked, their chants silenced with violence. Sacred relics were desecrated, prayers ridiculed. For many, faith was the only fragile thread that kept them alive, whispered in secret corners away from watchful eyes. It was dangerous to hope, but more dangerous to let despair consume completely. In Urga prison, every day was a war, a battle between cruelty and the human will to endure. And though most did not survive, their suffering echoed far beyond those walls, leaving scars on Mongolia's history that remain to this day. By late 1918, Urga prison had become a factory of death. The cells overflowed with men who wasted away in silence, their eyes hollow, their spirits broken. Guards rarely needed to swing their whips anymore. Starvation and disease did their work for them. Prisoners collapsed in the yard, too weak to stand, their chains rattling softly as if mourning the lives they once lived. Each day blurred into the next, marked only by the sound of another body being dragged away. Outside the walls, the city of Urga carried on. Merchants filled the markets, monks chanted in temples, and children played on the dusty streets. Few dared to look at the prison, and fewer still spoke of what happened within. The fortress stood as a silent reminder of the cruelty hidden in plain sight, a wound the city tried to ignore. But the smoke from its chimneys, the smell of decay carried on the wind, betrayed the horrors to those who lived nearby. Survivors who somehow endured told stories of unimaginable cruelty, prisoners forced to beat one another, executions carried out in the dead of night, and guards who laughed at human suffering. Each testimony painted the same picture. Urga prison was not a place of justice, but of annihilation. It was less a prison than a graveyard, its walls built not to hold men but to erase them. For those trapped inside, hope was a dangerous thing, yet even in the darkest corner some clung to it. A whispered prayer, a shared piece of bread, a memory of family. These small acts of defiance became the only light in a place built entirely of shadows. As 1918 came to a close, Urga prison stood as a monument to human cruelty. Thousands had passed through its gates, but only a fraction lived to tell their stories. Those who did emerge were broken in body and spirit, scarred for life by the horrors they had endured. They carried with them not just wounds, but memories that would never fade. Memories of chains, of screams in the night of friends who never saw the light of day again. The outside world eventually learned fragments of the truth. Traders, travelers, and survivors whispered about the conditions inside, and slowly, Urga prison became infamous beyond Mongolia's borders. To some it was a symbol of failed justice. To others it was a lesson, why a warning of what happens when power goes unchecked and humanity is stripped away. But to those who had lived it, no description could ever capture the reality of its darkness. In time, the prison's role would fade into history, its walls crumbling as Mongolia changed and moved forward. Yet its legacy remained carved into the memory of a nation, a wound that spoke of cruelty, silence, and survival against impossible odds. The story of Urga prison reminds us of the thin line between civilization and savagery, and of how easily men can become monsters when unchecked by law or conscience. More than a century later, the ruins of Urga prison still whisper of suffering. Its stones stand as witnesses to the horrors of 1918, a warning that history must never forget. Thanks you for watch. Every old story holds a lesson worth remembering. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe for watch and listen more old times, real stories, and don't forget,